It's 9:52 Eastern Standard Time, December 23rd, 2018. By the time you see this will be the past, and this will be a message going out to whoever finds it in the future. It's time. It's time for BS with S.A.C. Now, when last we met, we were reading new tricks because we're not done with it yet. And William had gotten captured by someone. Ollivander thinks it's bandits or rats or pirates or something. Ollivander goes off to look for them, follows the trail to the river, and figures he's going to have to go to Calyx Landing to find a boat to meet up with them. But we don't know what happened to William yet, and we're going to find that out today. In Chapter 9, Life at Sea. William clenched his fists firmly around the rope, dangling in the darkness. His knuckles would have been white from effort had there been any light. One straining hand after another, he pulled himself up its thick length until at last he'd reached the top. He couldn't remember how long he'd been hiding. Hours, days. Long enough for the air to get stuffy, he knew that much. He hoped his peak would give him a point of reference, something to let him know how much time had passed, and how long he had left to reach home. The boy slipped his fingers out of the flap and fumbled at leather and canvas and buckles until he felt the strap go slack and fall loose. His head crept upward, giving him a glimpse through the narrow opening. It was dark wherever he was, wooden, dimly lit, definitely indoors. No view outside, though. The room heaved back and forth a little, though he couldn't feel it from inside his hole. He could see the slight sway back and forth of the hanging lantern. The bag rested in an elevated position, maybe a couple of feet from the floor, which he noted was also made of wood. All around he could see a number of barrels and crates and sacks of all sizes and contents. Clearly, this was a storeroom aboard a ship of some kind. A scraggly-looking fellow sat beside the door in a drunken stupor, empty wine bottle in hand. He wore a rough beard, vulgar tattoos, and clothes that had seen more seasons than even their bearer could recall. From his belt hung a simple short sword and a small ring of iron keys. A bit of wood jutted out from where he once kept a leg. Pirates. William had never actually seen a pirate before, but he had heard stories, tales told around fires in the same hushed tones his uncle affected for stories of ghosts and demons and other cautionary nightmares. Tales of sin and debauchery, of rape and pillaging, of murder, theft, and carnage, of unwashed men who could spend years at sea yet look and smell as though their bodies had never touched water. William couldn't vouch for the violence and bloodshed, but when he returned home he could at least confirm the stench. William came back down and sat at the bottom of the bottomless bag. He'd had the foresight to tie a rope to one of the shoulder straps before diving in and taking cover from the roving land pirates. What he hadn't considered was that said pirates might throw whatever booty they found at camp into the bag along with him. It had been an adventure unto itself, avoiding the raining loot and debris shortly after he dove in. Fortunately, William had kept his wits about him, and he'd made it up to the top of the rope in time to clog the opening with assorted gear, creating the impression of fullness. No sense letting his attackers realize someone could be inside. Now, some time later, William surveyed all that he'd been given in hopes of finding some item to aid his escape. He still had his crutch and sword. The bottomless wineskin also lay on the floor of the enchanted backpack. He had a map, but no light to read it with. He had rags tying a femur to his leg, also not useful. Perhaps if he could find the twin bag. He searched the cluttered bottom. Single shoes he'd found on the side of the road mingled with rocks shaped like heads or animals or other meaningless shapes. He found an empty flagon he'd lifted from the Laughing Raven as a souvenir, a tree branch from the flooded forest, bits of string. How much worthless garbage had he collected, and why? Did he honestly think he might need any of it, that any of it carried any sort of monetary value? Or perhaps he just wanted to see how much stuff the bag could hold. Either way, the piles of worthless dreck in no way made finding the twin bag any easier. Not that it would matter, he realized. Who stored a bag in a bag anyway? William reflected on the absurdity of his situation. He was surrounded by mounds of useless items stuck deep at the bottom of a backpack in the cargo hold of a pirate-filled ship in the middle of God's new where with no way to call out for help. At least he had his health. He prodded his leg. Nope, didn't have that either. Terrific. He needed a plan. A good plan this time. Not his usual put out the lights and fight a half-dozen expert swordsmen in the dark type of plan, or his hide in a backpack type of plan. Something slightly more along the lines of hide in a tree from wolves until a killer skeleton arrives variety. He briefly contemplated the odds of a skeleton or a pack of wolves showing up to handle his unfortunate pirate situation. Not good. Slightly less not good odds would be for Ollivander to show up and save the day. Judging by the old man's behavior during the encounter in the cemetery, old Ollie would be lounging about in his bedroll, eating mutton and wondering what shenanigans the boy had gotten himself into, and if he'd be back in time for breakfast. Looks like you're on your own, William said again, failing to reassure. Looks like you're on your own, William said, failing to reassure himself. Again. Plans. Old Pegleg was sleeping. He had keys, which meant he was someone of moderate trust and importance. Probably. Which meant he probably knew a thing or two about swordplay, drunk or sober. The scimitar wouldn't do the boy much good against such a man. A fair fight would be foolish in itself, and William very much doubted the swashbuckler would fight fair. He also doubted the crusty salt would show leniency because of their one-legged kinsmanship. He would have to outsmart the fellow, trap him somehow. That couldn't be too hard, could it? After all, pirates were known for their bloodthirsty temperaments, not their dizzying displays of intellect. William searched the bottom of the bag for anything big and cumbersome, and bound what he could find to the rope. Then he tucked anything of value into an impromptu belt fashioned from the rags that had once been his favorite tunic. His sword, the map. He couldn't chance leaving anything of value in the bag. Once every oversized bit of junk had been tightly secured, and he'd equipped himself, he scaled the rope and slipped the bag open. The bottomless bag, it turned out, hung from a hook on the wall, and swung wildly when he attempted to climb out. He failed to account for the sudden weight shift, and went sprawling to the floor with a clattering of metal and a brief gasp of pain, still half tangled in the bottomless bag. Swollen ankles, he discovered, were not made for landing on. He stifled his cries of pain almost as soon as he made them, but he was too late. The quartermaster's eyes shot open. William meant to get up and run, but found himself frozen in place by fear, pain, shock, and the question of whether a quartermaster actually was the man in charge of supplies, or if he'd come up with the wrong term. Regardless, he'd woken the man, who looked none too happy. William regained his composure before Stumpy did, and he slid himself into the nearby shadows behind a barrel, wincing at each splinter that found his nude flesh. Why had he put all his clothes in the twin bag? Were tattered rags really worse than being naked and alone aboard a pirate ship? True, he didn't know at the time that he would end up on a pirate ship, but better safe than sorry, right? He should have known better than to assume he'd get an easy night's sleep. The pirate rubbed his eyes, more surprised to be awake than anything, and checked the room for the disturbance. His gaze was alert, and his hand rested anxiously on the hilt of his sword. He visibly relaxed, shoulders slumping slightly, when he realized it was not the sudden arrival of the captain that woke him. He tensed again when he realized it meant someone else lurked in the storeroom, someone who didn't belong. "One of you flea-bitten blackguards sneaking a bite, eh?" he said, voice full of gravel. "Taking more'n his due?" William tried to slip back further behind the barrels and crates. To be fair, he did slip completely out of sight. His attempts proved nigh moot, however, when the scraping of his blade across the hollow wooden floor gave away his position anyway. He could hear Stumpy approaching, his footsteps an eerie thump-bang. He flicked the bottomless bag open and frantically began tugging at the rope. Thump-bang. "You can't hide from Bloody John forever." Bloody John? William definitely liked Stumpy better. It felt friendlier, less intimidating, certainly less likely to cut open his guts and wear his entrails as a belt. A newfound urgency fueled his efforts with the rope. Almost there. Thump-bang. "I know you're in there." William struggled with the bulky, tangled mass at the end of the rope, contorting into awkward positions to free it from the bag's opening, which was certainly smaller by comparison. Thump-bang. Come out, wherever you are." William could see the glint of steel coming around the corner right as the last of the bound assortment of branches and refuse slid free of the bag. He had no time to untie anything. to arrange anything other than the bag, which he left wide open on his side of the makeshift barricade of debris. A moment later, Stumpy John came into full view. A scowl adorned his face, chiseled on with some measure of permanence. William kicked himself back and away along the floor with his good leg, sword still scraping at the deck. Thump bang. Well, what have we here, eh? An unexpected wall abruptly halted William's retreat. Desperate, his hand flashed to his belt and freed the scimitar. He doubted Stumpy found him at all intimidating, but one could hope. Thump bang. A stowaway, naked as the day he was born. Well, you're naked as the day you die, too. Please, William begged. I got lost and... We don't take kindly to stowaways here, Stumpy continued, clearly savoring the thought of an appropriate punishment. Thump bang. Not enough food, you see. It's a drain on resources. Can't have the crew starving out to sea now, can we? William held the scimitar out as best he could, hands trembling. Better stay back, he stammered. Yes, Stumpy continued, ignoring the quivering before him. Thump bang. We'll have to compensate for the food you took. I'm thinking you'll make a fine stew for the lads. I'm warning you, the terrified boy continued. Thump bang. Bloody John drew closer. Thump bang. Are you now? He asked, sneering. A malicious cackle slipped from his twisted smile and pinned William to the floor. Pointless, true, for William hardly had anywhere to escape to anyway, but the cackle didn't know it, and no pirate worth his salt had any qualms regarding overkill. Thump bang. Tears welled in William's eyes, but still the pirate drew closer. Thump bang. Halfway to him. Thump bang. Thump bang. Crossing the laughable barrier of branches and rope and rubbish. Thump bang. Thump. And he was gone. William could hear cursing coming from within the bottomless bag. He crawled toward the impromptu pit trap and peered in, grinning ear to ear. His harebrained scheme had actually worked. As focused as the pirate was on terrifying William before the kill, he hadn't looked where he was going and stepped right into the bottomless bag. Did I or did I not warn you not to come any closer? The pirate cursed more, defamed William's mother on grounds of appearance and chastity. William paid him little mind as he set about to scouring the storeroom for supplies. You'd think a guy with only one leg would pay more attention to where he stepped, William mocked. Stow it, Bloody John said from down below, and then silenced himself after the first 2 powder kegs fell into the bag, nearly crushing the captive buccaneer. If you insist, the boy said, with a grin, consider yourself stowed. It's what your mum said to me last night. I will thank you to kindly speak more respectfully of my mother, William commented, as politely as he could while dropping in the remainder of his gathered garbage in the dark hole. With the flap closed, he could barely hear the pirate scream, a relentless string of obscenities at him. William had neutralized the immediate threat, but he was not fool enough to imagine himself safe. He hobbled around the room looking for a crate that was light enough for him to push with one leg, but not so empty as to pose no problem for others to shove aside. For a moment he considered asking his pet pirate Stumpy for the keys, but did not feel up to hearing in vivid detail the sexual acts the old salt intended to perform upon every member of his family. Instead, he found an open crate of apples, and after hungrily devouring 2, he emptied it until moving it offered no challenge. Inch by inch, he heaved the crate at a snail's pace across the floor to block the door, before refilling the wooden box with its former contents. With the door now secured, William could focus on more pressing matters, specifically finding something to cover up with. After a brief search, he found an old pair of oversized trousers and a canvas bag, which, after three slits of his scimitar, became a shirt. He tightened his makeshift belt to keep his pants from his ankles, under the reasonable assumption that he would have much easier time running away with his trousers in the up position. He couldn't find any boots, but contented himself with not displaying his birthday suit to the world. William pulled the map from his improvised belt and spread it open. He was in the 5th realm somewhere, that much he could tell. He must have passed through the 4th realm's 5th gate while still in the bag. Small favors. Gates, especially water gates, terrified William. At least now he'd only have to pass through one before reaching home. But where in the 5th was he? And which gate was closest? If he could determine how to enlarge the image, he could figure out exactly where he was, but Ollivander had never explained how the map worked. With nothing to guide him, the boy resorted to trial and error. He shook the map. He held it upside down and slid it side to side. He tapped it. He used magic words from children's tales. He squinted. He focused his will. He squinted even harder. He blew on it. He prodded, which at least made the image shift to one side, but in no way actually helped him get a better view of the map. He squinted until his head shook. Soon William grew bored of trial and error and simply played with the map. He'd mash his fingers against the enchanted parchment and flick the image back and forth across the paper, trying to see if he could get various mountain ranges, lakes, and other geographic elements to pass through a narrow gap he had made with the fingers of his other hand. After 5 minutes, he found he had become quite adept at world flicking, for such was the name he'd given his new sport, and wondered if ever he could form a league or host a tournament. Then, just for fun, he flicked the fifth realm inward from both sides, expecting it to spin. It didn't. What it did do, however, was shrink. William glowered at the map, its image uselessly small. "Now you're just spiting me," he muttered, scowl ever present. His blazing glare could have burnt the parchment then and there. Then his eyes softened to a mere agitated gaze before changing once again to a look of intense curiosity. His right eyebrow raised as his lips pursed. A flicking inward shrank it. He placed 2 fingers near the center of the tiny image of the world and slowly pulled them apart. The image followed, stretching to fill the gap between. He slid his fingers together and the world shrank again. For longer than was prudent, he toyed with the map, expanding and shrinking, zooming in on single farms before pulling out far enough that all the world could fit beneath the tips of his fingers. He had to admit he felt a little like a god. A knock on the door pulled him from his amusements and reminded him of the particularly serious nature of the situation. His body went rigid. Sweat formed on his brow. He didn't blink, didn't twitch, didn't even breathe, as though somehow total stillness might make the interloper change his mind about whatever it was he wanted. Statues had moved more. Knock, knock. Body still immobile, William's mind panicked and raced around his head with its metaphorical arms waving, clawing wildly at the air. Should he move? Maybe the pirate on the other side would be suspicious if he didn't hear the peg-leg thump-bang of Stumpy's steps coming for the door. If William stayed put, they would surely suspect something. He could mimic that with his crutch, right? Then again, if he did move, it would mean that Stumpy John was up and about, but not answering the door, and that might make them angrier. And the quartermaster, he still wasn't convinced that was the correct term, had been asleep when William escaped from the bottomless bag. Who's to say he wasn't asleep now? Decisions. The door handle jiggled as the door rattled in its frame. "Open up, Bloody John, before I string you up for hoarding the rum." How well could he impersonate Bloody John's voice? The man's accent was a 10th or 11th realm one, which William was abysmal with. The pitch was lower than his own register, much more gritty from years of hard drinking and swearing, and the boy certainly lacked the old salt's prowess at turning a phrase both colorful and profane. They would know in an instant that he wasn't Bloody John. "Come off it, John, are you in there or not?" Grinding his voice to its lowest notes, William muttered the only pirate thing he could think of. "Yar." "Well, then open up. The men are getting a mite tired of singing shanties with nary a drop to wet their gullets." The boy tried to calm himself, to rein in the doom-filled thoughts that galloped with reckless abandon across his cranial countryside. He had to get Stumpy's voice, something to make the other man leave, but without causing Stumpy to call for help or otherwise break the illusion of his controlling presence in the supply room. William grabbed a handful of apples from a nearby barrel and quietly unlatched the bottomless bag. Light shone down at the dark hole, giving the boy the chance to throw a couple of apples down at his captive, hitting him squarely on the head. "Oh, now what?" Bloody John bellowed. William's hands flashed faster than sight, bringing the flap down. "I've already said, John, the men need hooch." The man on the other side rattled the handle to emphasize his point. William threw open the bag again and resumed pelting Stumpy with apples. "Come off it," Stumpy protested. "Haven't you had enough?" Again the flap closed. "Course not. You can never have enough." The door rattled again. William flung open the bag and laid down a barrage of fruit, assailing the pirate. "Bugger off and stop tormenting me, or I swears when I get out of here, I'll dig up your grandmother and I'll pillage her like a villager." William closed the flap again, though this time out of modesty. He had no intentions of hearing exactly how Bloody John intended to defile his saintly grandmother's corpse. He hoped that whoever stood on the other side had similar notions. He waited, breath held like a pirate in a bag. Silence. Then after a moment or three, he heard footsteps walking away. Normal footsteps, no peg legs. Sheesh. I'll tell 'em, but they ain't gonna be happy about it, the voice muttered under his breath. No need to drag grandmum into it. William exhaled the tension in one long, slow breath. He had averted disaster, for now, but he had the sinking suspicion his luck wouldn't hold out long. Pirates, if legends could be believed, weren't the type to sit idly by while someone withheld alcohol. Soon that voice would be back, and it would have a dozen other voices accompanying, all brandishing sharp, pointy things. William had a natural aversion to sharp, pointy things, particularly when the pointy part pointed at him. And that's where we're going to stop for today. Tune in next time when we'll see how William gets himself out of this mess. Or does he? Until then, have good dreams.